Now, the kind of elephant in the room that nobody's asked, but you probably have thought about is, I'm showing you this page of Gemara, I'm telling you all about what happens in yeshiva, and you're asking, why doesn't this happen in seminary, right? You've been here this long, you haven't seen anything that looks like this, right? And why don't you learn Gemara, right? Now, the answer to that question is that learning Gemara, men are obligated to learn Gemara. Women are not obligated to learn Gemara. It's not forbidden, but they're not obligated. And if you're not obligated, then this is not the most efficient way to learn about Judaism, right? I'll explain what I mean. Right? When I got married, so my wife and I came to Israel for a year, right? For me to learn yeshiva, my wife learned in seminary. Right? It's called Shana Rishona. It's a great thing to do. Lots of people do it. You get married and you decide, you know what? First year of marriage, well, let's be away from family stresses. Let's not spend the year that we'll come home at the end of the day and I'll talk about my boss and you talk about your boss. But let's spend the year that we'll come home at the end of the day and we'll talk about what I learned in yeshiva, what you learned in seminary. Right? My wife and I liked it so much, we stayed a second year, and 14 years later, we're still here, right? But, so when we came home after our first day, so I said to my wife, so what did you learn today? So she said, well, we had a class on prayer, and we had a class on how free will works, and we had a class on, the cycle of the Jewish year, and the role of the Jewish woman, right? And I said, wow, that sounds amazing. She said, it was inspiring, and I learned so much information. And I said, that's great. She said, what did you learn today? I said, well, we opened up our Gemara, and we are studying a very interesting Mishnah about what happens if we have a sheep, and that sheep is on our roof, right? And the sheep somehow, even though we have a railing around the roof, falls off the roof. Right, and we live on the 10th floor, and the roof, as it's careening to its horrible woolly death, right, happens to land in our neighbor's tomato patch, right, which creates a woolly red splattery mess, right, saving our sheep's life but destroying our neighbor's tomatoes. Do we have to pay for the tomatoes? Right, that's the question in the Mishnah. And my rabbi told us we're probably going to be discussing this in the next 3 or 4 weeks, right? So my wife looked at me and said, that's what you're learning in yeshiva? Like, look what I learned today. I learned about this topic and that topic, and I learned this information and that information. You're going to spend 4 weeks talking about maybe you should pay for the tomatoes, maybe you shouldn't pay for the tomatoes, maybe you should have to pay for the value of a pillow, but not for the value of the tomatoes, because a pillow would have been enough to save the sheep's life. Maybe I shouldn't have to pay anything, because I did put a fence up there after all, right? Maybe my sheep should now belong to my neighbor. There are all kinds of possibilities, right? That's what you're going to discuss. We don't even have a sheep, and our neighbors don't have a tomato patch, and we don't even have access to a roof, right? So why are you studying this, right? What's the answer to that question? Why would anybody ever study this? Anybody? Okay, so the answer is, like we talked about, that what I want to do is not know the information. You're right, the situation might never come up. But I want to understand what is the Torah's approach to damage law, right? How much of it is dependent on this factor and that factor, and what about this situation, what about that situation? Also, I can understand the principle better. I remember we talked about chicken sexing. I've got your attention, right? Chicken sexing is a profession that I learned about from one of my students, right, which works a lot like this. Apparently, right, to become a chicken sexer is a very lucrative profession, apparently, right? I don't know if they offer internships in chicken sexing, right? What you do to be a chicken sexer is that when a baby chick is born, you look at the chick and you separate out the males and the females, right? Now, what is the visible factor on a chick that tells you whether it's male or female? There isn't one, right? So how can you tell? I can't write a textbook about how to tell the difference between a male chick and a female chick, because they look exactly the same, right? But people who are chicken sexers have been doing this for a long time. They just know, right? But they can't tell you, here are the rules. If it's, like those books that say, like, you're trying to figure out what kind of tree something is. Does it have leaves with 3 things or 4 things? If 3, turn to page 18. If 4, turn to, until finally you get to the thing. There is no book like that. All you can do is watch somebody who knows what they're doing and gets, like, the concept of what's a male and what's a female, right? They got the concept. You can keep watching them say, this one's male, this one's female, this one's male, this one's female. So now I get the concept. And now I could do it. But I still can't tell somebody how to do it, right? So we're trying to get to that concept, right? Now again, men are obligated to do that. But you can imagine spending 4 weeks to get to some concept, which I might find out at the end of the day, there are actually different opinions about what that concept is, or whether we're trying to get to this concept or that concept, right? If I don't have to do that, that is not the most effective way to use my learning time, right? You can imagine if you came on this program and every morning you learned Gemara and that's all you did, right? So you'd walk away at the end and somebody would say, wow, tell me about what you learned. And you say, well, I learned about what happens if a sheep falls off a roof. But what about Shabbat? Did you learn anything about Shabbat? No. Anything about prayer? No. Did you learn anything about how free will works? No. Right? Did you learn anything about living with mindfulness and consciousness? Right? No. Just talked about sheep. Right? So that's not a practical use of your time. Plus, not to mention, what language is the Mishnah written in? We discussed last time. Mishnah is written in Hebrew. What language is the Gemara written in? Aramaic. So in order to do this properly, you have to learn Hebrew and Aramaic. So any free time we have when we're not learning about sheep, we're going to work on your Hebrew and Aramaic grammar, right? So if you spend 4 or 8 hours a day doing that for a year or 2 years, you might get it down. But it's just not, if you're not obligated to do that, then that's not how you're going to spend your time, right? But the process of learning Gemara is not about the information you're covering. It's about learning the way of thinking, right? And that's why people have to spend lots and lots of time on it. Right, just to finish off, this is why, and I always ask people, why do you go to rabbis to ask for life advice? Right? Like people come to rabbis and ask for all kinds of questions, right? Not just like, Rabbi, is this pot kosher? But like, Rabbi, do you think I should marry this guy? Or Rabbi, do you think I should live in this community or that community? Or Rabbi, do you think I should send my kids to this school or that school? Or Rabbi, tell me what's an appropriate way of disciplining a child, right? All kinds of questions like that. Why are people asking rabbis that question? Like, I might know a lot of Talmud. So if your sheep falls off a roof, I'm your man, right? But like, why would you come and ask for life advice, right? So what's the answer to that question? Good. So if you know the principles, then you can figure out any new question that comes your way, right? Now again, you got to become a scholar to do that. You can't just know a page, right? But the more a person knows Talmud, the more they become like a person who knows the principles. And once you know the principles, you could say, listen, if anybody, you go say, Rabbi, should I marry this guy? And he says, that's a good question. I think I remember seeing that in the Talmud. It says here on page 21a, yes, you should marry him, right? So hopefully that's not what's going to happen, right? If somebody does say that, run very fast the other way, right? But what he is hopefully going to say is, listen, the Talmud didn't ask that question. But had the Talmud asked that question, I can tell you how it probably would have answered. Because I've got the principles down, right? So that's what a person who's studying Talmud is trying to do. He's trying to get back to what are these principles that Hashem gave to Moshe about how to think, about how the world works, about how we answer difficult questions, right? Once I've got that done, then I can answer questions that come my way that I never thought about before, right? And that's how do rabbis know if electricity is allowed on Shabbos or not? It doesn't say in the Chumash, and thou shalt not use electricity on Shabbos. It doesn't even say it in the Gemara. Why not? Good, there was no electricity. Nobody even knew what the word electricity meant. Right? The word chashmal, which is modern Hebrew for electricity, does appear in Tanakh. It does appear in Tanakh, right? Referring to the angels, how they move with speed and in a way that you and I would call electric, right? But that word existed before Thomas Edison came along, right? But so how would a rabbi deal with it when electricity was created? There was this big discussion when electricity was created. Can you do this on Shabbos, right? So first the rabbis had to learn everything there was to know about electricity. Right? They became experts in how electricity works. And then they could flow it through the principles of what makes something allowed or not allowed on Shabbos and decide is it allowed or not allowed. And it came out that it's not allowed. Right? Somebody talks about, if you've ever heard a class on stem cell research or on surrogacy or any of these modern day science questions that come up, right? What does Judaism have to say about it? I promise you will not find a page in here that talks about whether it's ethical or not ethical to create a fetus, to take cells from it and then destroy the fetus. Right? You won't find anything about that in here. Right? You've got to know what are the principles of what makes something, what's called life, what's not called life, what's allowed for healing, what's not allowed for healing, right? What powers are we allowed to use, what aren't we allowed to use? If you've got those principles down, so when that new question comes your way, you can deal with it, right? That's what the Gemara is meant for, right? But without that, the rest of us can ask people those questions. Right? What we need to know is the more basics, which is something that, unless you learn the whole thing, which you're not going to do unless you have 7.5 years of free time, right? Then there are much more kind of focused ways to spend our time.